Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. So if there's any questions, I think I can see raised hands. So I'll move my screen over here. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll, I definitely want to allow for lots of discussion, and I don't have so much content that will be hurting for time. And so there'll be lots of Q&A time at the end, but if something comes up to you, you raise your hand, I should see that, and I'm happy to pause for that. Okay. So I want to take the first maybe 5 minutes or so to introduce Copperleaf, the company I work for, because that will give some important context from some of the perspectives I'll have as I talk about equitable investment strategies. And I'm going to use some language in how we talk about the impact on communities of our investment plans, and giving a bit of background on our company and sort of the problem we solve as like a 5-minute background is useful in understanding some of those terms in that context. So Copperleaf is what we call a decision analytics solution. We, most of our clients are utilities, all of whom manage critical infrastructure. And what we do is we help these organizations managing critical infrastructure make decisions on how they invest in that infrastructure. And those decisions are based on what we call a value-based decision-making methodology. And that means understanding when we don't have money or resources to do everything that we want, or not only being constrained by money or resources, but having objectives or targets, that we can make decisions on the trade-offs from our investment plans in terms of value, so that we understand the value of our investments. We understand that value in terms of mitigated risk, for example, and that articulation and communication of value is what allows us to make decisions. So we've got customers all over the world in 5 continents. As I said, most of these are utility customers, and we've got sort of the biggest clients listed on this screen here. And each of these is referenceable if you know anybody at these customers, or if you know anybody at these utilities, or if you're part of these utilities, that you're likely to have heard of us, and each of them is very happy to talk about us. And I just sort of wanted to say that because I know that several attendees on this call, even just some of the names I've seen already, are people that we've worked with, and they're at these utilities. And so there's a deep understanding of Copperleaf with those clients. And so that's just who Copperleaf is. That's where I come from. And I want to talk a little bit, just a minute or two, on the problem that we solve, right? What does it look like when we talk about value-based decision-making with investment planning and how we invest in our infrastructure? So in this example here, this is a hypothetical example, but you've got 2 projects that are very different, right? One of them is this replacing an electrical asset, and the other one has to do with brand new IT system, for example. And we can say that these 2 projects have different costs. One is 2 million, one is 4.5 million, but they've got different time scales, right? One's only a year, the other's 2.5 years. And obviously that's not enough to make a decision on what project we would do first. And we start to analyze that decision by looking at value. Right, so one of them might reduce O&M savings by a certain amount, and there's going to be a different amount for the other project. The business case will be driven by improved reliability, right? And this obviously looks different for an electrical project versus an IT project, right? One might be focused on safety, the other one cybersecurity, and maybe there's different execution risks, right? And that could be, there's a risk that this project would take longer or cost more, or that there would be, a risk to other infrastructure by executing this project. And you could use Excel or a pen and paper and kind of figure this out for 2 projects if you had the right knowledge, the right SMEs in the room. But doing this over an entire portfolio of projects where you have thousands of these projects, and you've got budget constraints and dependencies and resource constraints and targets, becomes really difficult. That's hard to do that when you have Excel. It's hard to communicate the value and understand trade-offs as you talk about value and risk over time. So this is what Copperleaf does. You've got a bunch of projects, you know their value, you know how that value changes over time, and then you make decisions on those plans for projects. And I want to talk about this value framework because as I talk about equitable investment strategies and um, social impact of investment plans at the community level, we need to do that in terms of value and what value means. I'm going to take a second with this introduction of the Copperleaf value framework to support that discussion. So it's not just that, this isn't a webinar on what Copperleaf is and how we use Copperleaf. This will be the last Copperleaf slide, but it's just important for me to set up this next discussion when we talk about value. So in Copperleaf, the value framework, what we mean by that is a set of models. These models are applied to investments. So there'll be a model that was like, I have this electrical transformer replacement project. I'm going to have the transformer model attached to that. And this model is going to have inputs from, these inputs I have in this diagram, they're optional, but maybe this is a data repository. Maybe I'm looking at asset attributes like age of the asset or manufacturer or whatever. Maybe I have guided questionnaires that are going to prompt the user to say, well, how many customers are being fed by this investment? Or how many customers being served by this asset live in an economically disadvantaged zone, for example? I might prompt the user for that. And then outputs of that, it's going to calculate risk over time, right? That's the big one. I might understand costs from that. And this second one here, obviously there's a lot on the slide here because the concept of a model can get complicated as we think about all the different ways that we would determine value from an investment. We might have what we call a service measure, and this could be reliability, for example, or it could be emissions. So maybe I'm calculating SAIDI or SAFE at the asset level. And as I get to later, that is going to be important when I apply a model to an investment, and that investment is serving customers in an economically disadvantaged area. And I want to communicate the impact in terms of mitigated risk, but also emissions or SAIDI or safety as other reliability metrics. Okay. So what I'm trying to say with this slide is that in Copperleaf, we are calculating these either at the asset or investment level. And these, what we call these measures of value, are useful metrics in communicating social impact. Okay, so what does this look like at an investment level? So maybe I have an investment that is, the main driver is increased revenue, but it also reduces customer interruptions, right? I've got these two measures that are being calculated by the model, and I've got the cost, and what Copperleaf is doing is providing a net present value based on those three measures. And I could do that with a number of investments. And then with Copperleaf, obviously, I do this with a whole portfolio of projects. I've got very different drivers for different projects. Sorry, I said I'd be able to look at questions, and I've minimized that window so I don't see raised hands. Let me go back to that. I've got all these different drivers for projects, and I've got a massive portfolio of investments, and I'm able to compare them. Basically, I have a total present value. When I talk about value of investments, it doesn't matter what kind of project this is. I have a way to compare them and talk about value in a single term, right? Just in terms of the units of value. Okay, so that's Copperleaf. That's what I mean when I say value. Okay, and when I think about the value of investments and a portfolio of investments, I wanted to provide you that context. I'm going to talk about environmental justice, energy justice, and how we would use that kind of framework for communicating social impact and why that's important. Before I do that, since I just kind of gave this technical, wasn't too technical, but it was a bit technical explanation, I want to pause to see if there's questions. And I can see raised hands if that's how you'd like to ask them, or you can just unmute. Okay, you can raise your hand again, and I can I can see the window here, so I can stop as I see that. Sorry, I prematurely went back. So environmental justice, basically what this means is that when you have certain populations that have higher emissions exposure or higher exposure to environmental health hazards or environmental risks, when there's a disproportionate level of that exposure based on social demographics or income or certain populations, we call that an environmental injustice, right? So if we say lower income communities or racialized communities have greater emissions exposure from SF6 transformers, as an example. And maybe this is because of the cost of living in communities around stations. as one of many factors. But then we say, okay, that's an environmental injustice because now you have certain populations that have a disproportionate exposure. Energy justice is related, but slightly different. And this is, we talk about equity in social and economic participation in the energy systems. So we can say an example of an energy injustice is when you have high energy costs, and that being more burdensome to low-income people than otherwise, because it's a higher portion of their income being spent on energy. And then you start to get into energy as a right, and what it means when certain populations can't pay for their energy. And obviously there's complex socioeconomic factors and solutions to those, but that's an example of what we think about when we think about energy justice and fair participation in the energy system. So it's important to define those terms. And again, if I can just provide examples to that, right? I talked about more emissions exposure to disadvantaged communities. So that could be communities that live near carbon emitting generating stations, communities that live near leaky station assets or highways and traffic. And again, a big reason for that has to do with the cost of properties, cost of living. Homes are more affordable near the highway. Homes are more affordable near generating stations, etc. Or homes that have that are just older have older infrastructure, right? So in the context of gas utilities, that there are gas mains that are just older in older neighborhoods, and those older neighborhoods are more affordable. But the same can be said about reliability and distribution assets that are just older, right? And that obviously presents a higher asset risk. It presents greater leaks, worse reliability. And this isn't to say it's always the case, but just when there's older infrastructure, there's just problems associated with that infrastructure in terms of risks. And as I said earlier, obviously we have this greater impact of energy cost increases, right? That has to do with lower incomes. It also has to do with less efficient homes. When you have energy efficiency or lower energy efficiency, obviously you're paying more for energy. So what's the impact to investment planning? And why is this important for utilities? I'm sure if you're all here, you're aware of this. Examples, just recently, the EPA added, I don't know if you guys saw, there's a few articles about this, how the EPA added to its National Informants and Compliance Initiatives environmental justice. An article just came in the New York Times yesterday about the PFAS, this water contaminant, also added. The same proposal and the same addition to this PFAS water quality enforcement was environmental justice is something that the EPA is going to enforce. Okay. Another example is the California Public Utility Commission has added environmental and social justice elements to its risk-based decision-making framework. Even just going back to December and right now, current talks with the commission in California are around how can we add environmental and social justice consideration to investment planning, right? And California is not alone. That's just one example. Obviously, we have many states, many areas where I'm sure you're operating in right now that have some kind of requirement around this. The last figure I checked had 10 states in the United States with existing environmental justice legislation in some form or another, with another 13 pending. Actually, it's possible I got that the wrong way around. 13 with legislation and 10 pending. The point is, roughly half the United States have legislation around environmental justice, and that works its way into regulation. State to state, that looks different, right? We can talk about environmental justice and environmental justice communities in one state, and maybe that's articulated entirely different in another state where it's about disadvantaged communities and lower median income. And the shape of these regulations also differs. It might be in some states, in Illinois, for example, it's 40% of all benefits for utility investment planning must be directed. The language they use is EJR3, but really this means disadvantaged communities. In California, right, this is about an ESJ pilot, environmental and social justice pilot, where you have to demonstrate consideration. Okay. There's another example that came from 2021, I think, in the United States, in Arizona, where there was a planned expansion of a gas burning generating station that the regulator basically denied because it was the language they used was, I mean, among other factors, not enough consideration around impacts to historically Black communities nearby. So what the regulator is doing and how they're enforcing or what their ask is around equity, environmental justice, energy justice, looks a little bit different. And in many cases, it's ill-defined. But the point is that it's this pressure, even from the federal government, to say we have to think about how we're being fair with the way that we invest in our infrastructure and the way that we deliver energy to our customers, right? And how that looks again is different, but the theme is the same, is that we have to start being fair where how we're doing this and demonstrate consideration. Not that we're not being fair before, but that it's been difficult to communicate, how we're being fair and how we're considering equity. I should clarify that. Looking for hands up. Obviously, the first step to that is to define what we mean by in disadvantaged communities or environmental justice communities. Again, the language varies state to state, but in order to talk about the impact, social impact, the community impact, there needs to be a community definition. How do we classify different areas or neighborhoods? Is it based on income or what is it? And there are a number of publicly available screening tools that facilitate this, that use census data and break out this data at the census level. In this example, I have CalEnviroScreen. It's a screening tool. It's specific to California, but many states have their own screening tools. Usually Screen or Screening is in the name of them. At the EPA level, federally, there's another dashboard called EJ Screen. It stands for Environmental Justice Screen. And if you're not familiar with these screening tools, I would encourage you to check out the EPA's tool, EJ Screen, or look to see if your state has a screening tool like this. In California, CalEnviroScreen, what it does is, what I show on this heat map here is a heat map of an index. And this index is determined by a number of factors, mainly exposure to pollutants. So there's data available that shows pollutants at enough granularity that we can map it out on a community level, as well as sensitivity to those pollutants. And that sensitivity is defined by, I mean, that this index is specific to California, but is defined by income, race. It could be defined by immigration. It could be defined by all these socioeconomic factors, not just in California, but however you want to define the sensitivity to pollution when you talk about what's equitable or environmental justice. Okay, and this becomes a really useful way. I mean, if we operate here, I have San Diego as an example, but if we're operating in San Diego and I know where my investments are, I know where my assets are, obviously that's the first step into talking about impact, because that impact is going to be different if this investment is near the Balboa Golf Course or if it's near Main Street in this red area, right? It's going to have a different impact, and that's because of the population, but it's also because of these other factors like pollution that's already exposed or impacts to that pollution, or sorry, sensitivities to that pollution. Are there questions on this? Are we familiar? Are we familiar with these screening tools, or is this entirely new? I don't know if you want to give a thumbs up reaction or whatever if you're familiar with these kinds of screening tools. You don't have to go off camera. I know Teams lets you do that. Or maybe this is new. I don't know. But I encourage you to check it out from wherever you're operating or wherever you live. If you have a tool like this, it's interesting, if anything, right, to sort of explore these communities. And then if you know where your investments are, think about how we can sort of communicate how that's important. I have a question about Canada here. Does Canada have the same? Does it need it too? It's a good question. I think it's necessary, right? I don't think the regulatory landscape doesn't look the same as it does in the United States. There's this federal push to say, well, there's the Justice 40 initiative, right? I don't know if you've heard about this in the United States, where we're saying that 40% of all federal funds, in certain cases, must go to disadvantaged communities. That federal push as well as state level pushes and regulation, has really applied pressure to create and rely on these screening tools. And we haven't had the same directive and legislative pressure in Canada. So it doesn't quite look the same. Okay, and so one way we could respond, I mean, obviously at this point we're not using Copperleaf. This is just your dashboard here, and you're still not using Copperleaf when you overlay your spend. Well, if you are using Copperleaf, you've got a convenient place for all your spend, and so you could push it to this here. But anybody can do this, right? You know where your projects are, you know how much money you have, you've used these screening tools to define what your communities look like. Let me back up a second. In Canada, you do have census data that's available. So whether there's a dashboard available to you in whatever area that you're operating that is as convenient as this, maybe not, but you do have that census data, and you can get you can create a BI tool that maps the factors that you care about, like immigration, education, race, income, whatever factors that you care about for your community definition. So if you knew by census tract or community level, how you classify these communities, here I've got like 4 colors, right? But it's an index with greater granularity than that. I could say, okay, well, anything that's a orange or red community counts in my definition as a disadvantaged community, as an example. Then I could say, well, this is where all my spend is across my entire portfolio, and this much of it is focused on what I'm defining as disadvantaged communities, right? And that becomes the first step to talking about social impact. That's really convenient to do, and that does tell you a lot, because you can say, well, 40% of my portfolio or 10% of my portfolio, right, wherever you are and whatever your distribution looks like, is devoted to these communities. And that becomes part of, you could say, well, 10% of my assets are in these communities, but 15% of my spend is in these communities. And I can talk about relative spend in terms of asset distribution or population distribution. And it gives some context to what that spend distribution looks like. And when I think about this as an example, I said Illinois has this requirement where 40% of benefits need to flow to disadvantaged communities, what they call EJR3 communities. Then spend is a really readily available measure to do that. I've got this data available. I've got my dashboarding team that can whip something like this up, and that is a productive conversation to have. We can do better than that, though. It's possible to do better than that. There's factors that would govern the distribution of spend for asset risk distribution, asset age reasons. That isn't telling the whole picture, and it isn't the same as when you think about the value framework and the value measures, and we have different increased revenue, public perception risks, environmental hazards, safety and reliability risks and metrics. There's no communication here of impact in terms of value. It's spend. Spend is useful, but we can do better if we knew what the value was. Okay, so again, say we have defined, for argument's sake, that the orange and the red communities, we've set a threshold on the index from CalEnviro screen if you're in California, right? Or you'll have some other index and some other tool, right? EJ screen has an index, so you could use that if you wanted. Beyond that threshold, we say this is what counts as an environmental justice community or a disadvantaged community. And then looking at where all of my spend is, we're saying that the spend that occurs in these communities, I can make a portfolio of that, right? Let me just group all those projects, put them in a portfolio. A portfolio is like a folder, right? Group those projects. And if I'm using Copperleaf, right? Shameless plug. Then I have value for each of these. I have reliability metrics. I have spend. I have risk. I have emissions. And I can aggregate that at the portfolio level. And I can talk about impact in terms of value. Okay, so let's go back and remember 10 minutes ago when I talked about, we have the value framework and we have these different measures of value, and we could talk about the value of these different projects. Even though these projects, it's a transformer replacement, it's underground cables, it's whatever, it's a program to repair and maintain streetlights, right? These all have different drivers. I'm talking about value on a common scale here. I'm just saying value. If I have a portfolio of all these projects, then I can say, okay, well, this is my initial plan, right? The projects that were taking place in my disadvantaged communities as I defined them are bringing this much reliability, financial, security, safety, environmental risk that's costing this much, right? I can calculate this for my environmental justice or disadvantaged community portfolio. I can compare it to my broader portfolio in more affluent communities or different communities. Yes, there's a portal with PDF slides, and this is also being recorded, so you can get a copy of these slides. And then what I can do when I have this measure of value for this portfolio, I can compare to other regions. I can normalize by population, by number of assets, by feet, or by miles of cable, whatever I want to do. And then I can say, okay, well, I had this initial plan. It was giving value in this way. This is my articulation of impact, right? I'm saying this orange bar on the right is the spend that I have, right? It's negative value because I'm losing money, right? And then all these other bars here are positive. This is the value. This is what I'm giving this community when I spend this much, right? And then I could say, well, I have regulations that say I have to do X amount of this, or I have to replace this many miles of whatever, or I have an objective to reduce emissions from my fleet vehicles, so I have to reserve money for that. And then when I go back and I make these changes in order to account for either regulations or strategy or what if analysis, where I just want to know what happens if I put minimum funding that's a bit higher in these communities, etc. Well, how does that differ, right? And I can communicate that. I could say, well, if I had more funding, I could put more funding in these communities, and this is how that would bring more value, right? Because now I'm saying I'm thinking about my investment strategy in terms of impact to these communities. Right? We think about the impact of our investment plan in terms of safety risk mitigation, broadly speaking, right? We think about it in terms of reliability, right? This is unacceptable transmission reliability risk. We must be, spending money on these programs at this level minimum, et cetera. This is what we do when we have our rate applications. But now we can have that same argument at a community level to say that, my social impact strategy or my equitable investment strategy at the community level is based on an articulation of that value. Okay. If you're using Copperleaf, you're also optimizing, right? This is back to the, my world in Copperleaf and what we do. What that means is that for every investment in my portfolio, I know what the value is in terms of all these measures I talked about earlier. I know how that value changes over time, and I can have a constraint on spend. And what the solution will do is it will find me the highest value projects that obey that constraint. And it doesn't only have to be a spend constraint, it could be a resource constraint because I don't have enough crews, but it could also be an objective. I could say, okay, well, I showed you that value, that bar chart for the value of the group of investments that was delivering value to underserved communities. And I could say, as a part of my corporate strategy, I must keep the reliability. I have to keep the safety at a certain level. Or maybe I want to say there's a different, I'm going to set a minimum for the amount of safety risk I want to mitigate in this community. Whatever elements of my community strategy that I have, right? For every company, it's different what that looks like. I can put that in Copperleaf, and I can, since I'm articulating that impact in terms of value, and I know what the cost is, I could use Copperleaf to come up with the right plan that meets that target. And even if you're not optimizing what you're doing, well, obviously optimization is the best way to do this. You're able to compare different scenarios. I talked about back when I was a few slides ago, I talked about how when you're looking at the value in terms of reliability, safety, environmental risk, whatever measures you choose to use, you can look at how different funding levels would reduce risk or reduce emissions or change reliability measures like SAIDI or SAFE. And that, when you are trying to respond to these regulatory requirements around, for example, show me how you're considering environmental and social justice in your investment plan, or show me how 40% of your benefits are going towards underserved communities. You can do your you compare different funding scenarios based on value, and you can answer those questions much more easily. And you can be very clear about, well, what's the impact of greenhouse gas reduction when I change funds or when I change my funding level? How does risk change when I change my funding levels, right? What do I need to spend in order to meet a particular target? Okay, I'm able to do that kind of analysis. And this is how, there isn't this sort of magic bullet to say this is what's most fair, right? When we talk about considering equitable investment strategies, it's about saying, I understand how I'm impacting different people. And as I look at different ways to spend money and different plans for investing, I'm considering that impact. Right? And there's a ton of value when we do that to our regulatory filings and how we respond to pressure from the regulator. There's a ton of value to the community when we're saying, look, this is how I understand we're impacting different communities, and this is how we're measuring that impact, and this is how we're considering that.
Yes, I think we've got one question or comment from our technical advisor, Doug.
Well, you're not going to believe it. I'm at the end of the slides, so it's a perfect time.